Dr. David Bradshaw is professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky. In addition to his many scholarly articles, he's probably best known for his book, Aristotle, East and West, Metaphysics and the Division of Christendom, published by Cambridge University Press. I was grateful for the opportunity to spend some time recently with Dr. Bradshaw and for his willingness to sit down for this interview. So without further ado, I hope you'll enjoy this episode from my interview with Dr. David Bradshaw.
Well, so far as the warning that St. Paul gives against philosophy in Colossians, as I understand it, if you look at the Greek of that verse, he says, beware of philosophy and vain deceit, lest anyone beguile you, I'm afraid I can't quote it precisely, but with the rudiments of this world and not with the love of Christ. But if you look at the syntax, what he means is that lest anyone beguile you with his philosophy, with his own private opinions and preferences and his own private little sect. And there were many philosophical sects in the ancient world. There were the Platonists, the Stoics, the Peripatetics, the Epicureans, the Cynics. And a wonderful sort of portrayal of that is in the dialogue with Trypho by St. Justin Martyr. In the first 8 chapters, he describes how he was a student of ancient pagan philosophy, and he visited all these different sects, or teachers of each one of these different sects, to try to learn the philosophy, to try to find the true philosophy from that teacher, and how frustrated he was, because he went to, for instance, a Pythagorean, and the Pythagorean teacher said, well, I'll teach you philosophy, but first you have to learn all these different branches of mathematics and astronomy and harmonics, and this is a study that takes many years. And so he was afraid he might, not even live that long to be able to actually make it to the higher stages of study. And then he went to a peripatetic, which is an Aristotelian, and the teacher there said, well, I'll teach you, but here's my fee. And it was a pretty high fee. And that's kind of a jibe, I think, at the Aristotelians, because one thing that they were known for was teaching that the good life, the good human life, requires material goods and some degree of wealth. And finally he went to a Platonist, and the Platonist was the one who said, yes, I will teach you, and I will teach you a philosophy that is aimed at knowing God. Because that's what Justin really wanted. He wanted to know God. And so he learned the philosophy of the Platonists, and he was taken into it and persuaded, until he was out alone one night taking a walk, and he met someone, a stranger, who started questioning him about his philosophy, and really probing him on some of what you might say were some of the weaker points, such as the Platonist belief in the pre-existence of the soul and reincarnation. And, well, how do you know this? Can you really prove that your soul has always existed and always will exist? And why don't you remember your previous lives? And so forth. And Justin really didn't have a good answer for those questions. So he was frustrated and ashamed, and he was really more angry, I think, at reason itself, you might say, than anything else, because he felt like he had found the true philosophy, and here it had let him down again. And he was almost in despair. But this stranger that he was with explained to him, well, the trouble isn't philosophy, the trouble is that you've been seeking wisdom from human teachers, and you've been ignoring those who are inspired by God. And so he told him about the prophets of the Old Testament, and how they prophesied the coming of the Messiah, and how those prophecies were fulfilled in Christ. And how ever since the apostles and the disciples of Christ have been endowed with his divine power and have themselves the power of miracles, and the church has, which is his body on earth, continues his life here today. And so Justin wanted to learn this philosophy, and whenever he writes about Christianity, he refers to it as simply our philosophy, or sometimes as the true philosophy, as opposed to all these pagan philosophies that were sort of trying to get there but didn't have the fullness of the truth. And the later church fathers adopted this way of thinking, that Christianity is the true philosophy. In fact, Clement of Alexandria, he refers to it as the divine and barbarous philosophy. Because it's barbarous because it becomes from the Jews and not the Greeks. And yet it's divine because it's found in the teaching of divinely inspired prophets and teachers. So that, I think, is how we should think about the relationship of Christianity to philosophy, that Christianity provides for us what philosophy properly is seeking but can never achieve, which is true divine wisdom. And we find that today in the church and the church fathers. Orthodoxy is helpful in every area of philosophy, but in every area there's also a lot more work to be done. And that would definitely include, say, whenever you read any of the great modern philosophers, it might be, Descartes or Locke or Hume, sort of in the early modern period, it might be Kant, it might be Hegel, it might be Heidegger, it might be Nietzsche, it might be Sartre and Camus, it might be de Beauvoir, and on into the contemporary. You're always reading people who ultimately want God. They're seeking God, they're struggling to find God, you might say, in this web of concepts and thoughts that they're dealing with, which is largely what they've inherited from their predecessors. And being great philosophers, they change it, they add something, but still, their philosophy is about God even when they're not using the word. And that's true even for atheists like Sartre. When you read his famous talk that he gave in Paris right after the war, it's sort of the great manifesto of existentialism. Well, he begins by saying, because there is no God, therefore there is no human nature. And because there is no human nature, therefore we're free to define ourselves. But of course, as you keep reading, what you discover is that being free to define ourselves is ultimately a kind of unfreedom, because there's nothing that we properly seek or properly aim toward in that process of self-definition, so that it's arbitrary and indefinite, and so that anything goes as long as it's what I truly and authentically choose. And that's not a kind of a freedom, that's insanity. That's a kind of an egoism in which myself and my self-definition comes to define the whole world. And one of Sartre's famous sayings is, hell is other people. He really has no room in his philosophy for true relationship, much less anything like self-denial or self-sacrifice. So, but nonetheless, you can see how the predicate of the absence of God governs everything else that he goes on to say. And so Orthodoxy can speak to that directly by saying, what is it that he claims is absent? And now we'll go back to my answer to one of the earlier questions about St. Basil. Isn't really absent. Sartre is still seeking the good. He's still seeking that which he conceives to be good, namely authenticity and self-definition. But that is what has become his way of conceiving what we call God, right? Except it's a false conception. So it's a falsely directed desire. And Orthodoxy, it's one thing to refute someone's argument. It's another thing to provide the means for that person to be healed and to transform those inner desires and those inner, you might say, misconceptions and deep misconceptions. And only Orthodoxy provides that. Only Orthodoxy is a way of life that can enable people to overcome these very deeply rooted false conceptions that govern, I would say, all of modern philosophy in one way and another. Even those that are explicitly theistic still have deeply rooted misconceptions. So there's nothing in philosophy that there's nowhere in philosophy that Orthodoxy doesn't have something important to say. And there's also nowhere where I think it's been said sufficiently in the right ways, sufficiently long enough and loud enough, you might say, to really have the effect that it should. So there is a cadre of Orthodox philosophers working today, many in the U.S., some elsewhere, many in Europe actually, who you might say have begun that task. But we've just begun, and there's a lot more work to be done.
Hi again. Hope you enjoyed this episode from my interview with Dr. David Bradshaw. Please subscribe to get notified when new episodes become available. And if you do enjoy the content on this channel, please consider supporting the channel. There's a link to the support page on our website below this video. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.